Religious beliefs and their impact on society and science have been one of the most overlooked topics in modern times. Current interfaith dialogue is dominated by historical analysis, theological interpretations of texts, and disputes about institutional and organizational structures of competencies, power, influence, and hierarchy within each religious administration. However, the common denominator emerges neither from the religious discourse dialogue of interpreting texts, nor from disputes about organizational and institutional aspects, nor from humanitarian commitment, as this is shared with most secular NGOs. It is the mystical tradition in each faith that determines the different specifics of every world religion. Empirical findings in neurobiology, developmental psychology, and medicine can demonstrate the power and leverage any interfaith dialogue can achieve, making a substantial and sustainable contribution both to society and to personal individuation. Looking at religious dialogues from a psychological perspective, we can differentiate between three forms of dialogues, each of which serves a different purpose. First, intra-religious dialogue focusing on the code of conduct, rituals, and ethical standards required of members that explain both the world and the transcendent. Second, religion to society dialogue, which addresses secular and societal issues such as sustainability, poverty alleviation, human rights, and justice issues. And third, interreligious dialogue and the dialogue between the world religion. This interreligious or interfaith dialogue has the objective of emphasizing and outlining commonalities between all religions beyond their intra-religious belief systems, identifying some kind of differentia specifica. If this goal is to be achieved, an evidence-based approach from psychology, neuroscience, social psychology, comparative anthropology, and developmental psychology is needed to strengthen these interreligious links. There is a distinction between religious belief and spiritual practice. The former emphasizes rules, codes, and guidelines. It represents authorized texts that offer each member support, social cohesion, religious identity, and a general comprehensive interpretation of what the world is, what God is all about, and what the nature of human and society is. Religions are normally defined by their organizational structure, including taxes, administration, sanctions, membership fees, etc. Psychologically, this generates a so-called in-group, out-group effect. Those who are part of the group and those who are not. The later, spiritual practice, follows a different goal. From Tibetan Buddhism, Japanese Zen, Jewish Kabbalah, Islamic Sufism, to Christian mysticism, we find a second mystical current that expresses itself in spiritual rather than religious practices. Here, spirituality is transmitted by the senses and enhanced by sensomotor exercises. Instead of presenting intellectual content that is then critically discussed and shared with others within the community, spiritual practices all over the world call individuals to distance themselves from the protective function that religion communities offer, including the narratives, urging them towards an ongoing process of de-identification with the mind, the body, the social environment, and the society they live in. Whereas a religious person feels legitimated by history, by belonging to an in-group, and by text interpretations, trying to readapt to the social status quo, a spiritual person is pulled by the future, as it were, trying to gain greater authenticity through the experience of the absolute. In this reading, spirituality is less translative in the sense that it helps us to understand the world better than transformative, as it shifts the gravity of our consciousness towards greater inclusiveness, wholeness, and interconnectedness. Practices ranking from purification techniques like fasting or intentional deprivation like hermetic life, to unconditioned giving, including charity, grace, gratitude, forgiveness, service, humility, global empathy, or universal pluralism, to direct experiences of transcendence, to specific forms of exercise and physical activities like yoga, qigong, to practices of silence, of mantra and mindfulness, they all can help transcend and modify the fragile, transitory, often dysfunctional, intermediate, and weak ego state. These inter-religious practices have been done for thousands of years and now accumulated robust empirical scientific evidence that they work. Globally, about 95% of believers follow a religion, whereas 5% pursue a more spiritual pathway. Some authors use different terms, differentiating between extrinsic or exoteric religion and intrinsic or esoteric spirituality. These differentiations leads to different mental states and different societal and institutional outcomes, and eventually to a completely different form of interreligious dialogue. To further specify this, identification and de-identification are the two major psychological mechanisms that explain the reaction to the world and to oneself. The two figures or archetypes of the monk and the minister demonstrate this. The monk and the minister are two complementary opposites which exist within each individual. Both forms of life are historically determined, contingent, and relative. And each of us has a monk and a minister, a sacral and a secular life within us, complementary to each other. The monk tries to disidentify from oneself and from the world to attain a nirvana state or heaven. He or she is detached from the world, from the self, and its emotions and drives. Monks represent a minority. They normally live in a more ascetic and hermetic life. The minister, in contrast, has a life within a society and in public, representing a majority. He or she requires rules, codes, and conducts, ethics, and is identified with the world, with the self's drives and emotions. The monk reflects an internal journey beyond time, while the minister's journey evolves over time. The monk requires mantras, the minister metacognition. The first is inspired by the infinite life, the second by the finite incentives of societal life. In each of us, two archetypes, habit and postures, thinking and acting, working and traveling, talking and eating, even sitting and walking might be different. From sitting in a Zen posture to sitting in a comfortable chair, from fasting to eating fast food, from hermetic wandering to tourist traveling, from concentrated praying to chit-chatting, from giving charity to trading and conducting business, and from holding a yoga posture to playing tennis. Only this form of complementarity can lead to wholeness, beauty, autonomy, and freedom. It is the complementarity of the monk and the minister that transforms our mindset to become identical with the one taste. The one taste that integrates every single possible sensation and perception. It is that moment where silence suddenly generates a sound, or where everything is connected with everything everywhere. The moment where all manifestations, earth and history ever created, just begin to unfold, and the location where space and time have not yet started. The mystical approach to achieving greater peace, justice, sustainability, and a better world for each individual is at the same time smaller, bigger, and more indirect than the existing forms of religious dialogue. It is smaller because greater humility is required in the face of a purely rational narrative explaining the world. It is bigger because of the link to transcendence, the divine, the absolute, or emptiness. It is more indirect because the shared mystical practices lead to a change in consciousness and practice which enables peace, unconditioned giving and love, protects the environment, fights injustice, lies, and untruth beyond rational discourse. If religions become more contemplative, transrational, sacred in this manner, they will become more whole, leading to the spiritual aggiornamento required in the 21st century. This would also lead to a reconciliation of science with spirituality. Both are not opposed or exclusive to one another. Rather, they are complementary and non-reductionist. If religions were to become more versed in science, abundant evidence would be available on how the brain and how the mind work, how our societal life is being transformed, how to become more peaceful, fair, and sustainable, how to change our consciousness, and how to create a wider, broader, more inclusive, and deeper self. The how, meaning the practice we choose, is determined by each individual. The what, meaning the content, taking place in each individual is given by the whole or the absolute. In fact, most findings on the benefits of spiritual practices have solid evidence behind them. It is this form of interreligious dialogue, when the similarities of spiritual practices are compared and based on scientific evidence, that will eventually provide the differentia specifica any religion can provide to society. In short, during every breath we take, every mantra we recite, every fractal we see, or every idea we think, the potential to be in touch, inside, and in perception of the whole, the absolute, the infinity beyond space and time and beyond history and society is always there. This experience of being at one and the consequences which ensues at a societal level and for the future, underlying the differentia specifica of any religion on this planet.